Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, or possibly good evening, boys and girls, as this is a children's story reading. So, without further ado, we'll go to the next thrilling instalment of Jimmy and the Pink Diamond. They saw three ravens land at the small table on Granny's front balcony. Genya had the dirty blue-striped pillowcase clamped in his claws. The birds sat crowded together. Boris and his grandsons were waiting for Jimmy. They were too early, but that didn't matter to Buck-Buck. He couldn't wait to see what was going to happen next. 5 minutes later, a small, rather dusty grey-brown cat trotted around the corner and stood waiting by his front door. "There he is," yelled Buck-Buck. "Let's go, friend." Buttercup ticked the cafe window a few times with his large paw. Jimmy glanced over his shoulder and waved happily to them. This was the signal they had been waiting for. They rushed around the corner to see Jimmy. "Stand up, Buttercup," said Buck-Buck as they got to the door. "Put your hairy paws on them bells. You got to help me ring them bells now, mate. There you go." Buttercup put his paws on the entire row of bells attached to all of the little apartments in Granny's building. She heard the terrible ruckus in the hallway and looked out of her front window to see what all the commotion was about. The first thing she saw was a giant dog with paws on all of the doorbells, wagging his tail and looking up at her. Then she saw a small grey-brown striped cat with a naughty face and a large ginger tomcat standing next to him. She cried, "Jimmy, I just can't believe it, you lovely boy. Where have you been?" She rushed down the stairs and opened the front door. Jimmy jumped into her arms and began to purr. He licked her cheek. Everyone followed her up to her apartment. Once they were inside, they sat quietly in the living room. Granny heard a sharp tapping on her balcony window. She wheeled around and saw the raven sitting outside on the table. She thought just for a moment that she was losing her mind. Anna opened the front balcony door and the birds hopped in, dragging the old pillowcase. "Good evening, Mrs. Granny," said Grandfather Boris politely. "Lovely night, isn't it?" He bowed deeply and introduced everyone. Anna was so surprised that she couldn't think of anything to say for a few seconds. She found herself staring at them. That wasn't polite. Granny's living room had suddenly filled up with animals. They were all talking to each other, and one of them, the one who was wearing those elegant reading glasses, had just spoken to her in English. Jimmy and Buck-Buck sat on the sofa. Grandfather had made himself comfortable in Granny's favourite chair. Genya was standing expectantly next to the refrigerator. Anton was perched on the bookcase, and Buttercup sat on the rug next to Buck-Buck, thumping his tail as usual. They all seemed to be waiting for her to say something. So she did the only logical thing a respectable Dutch lady could do in that situation. "I know it's a bit late," she laughed, "but let's all have a nice cup of tea and some cake." She laid the table with 7 plates, brewed a large pot of sweet tea, made a mountain of pancakes, and brought out a very large plate of ginger cake with butter and strawberry jam. There were slices of cheese, some sausages, and a big bone for Buttercup. The animals took their places at the table. The dog was too big. He didn't need a chair. Everyone had his own serviette and his own knife and fork. "Bon appetit," said the Granny to the giant dog. He barked and thumped his tail on the floor. She threw him a very large bone. It was the last of the Sunday roast. "Yummy, yummy, очень вкусно," mumbled Genya to no one in particular. He had a whole pancake wedged into his beak. Grandfather translated, "He means very, very tasty." Jimmy dripped butter down his front. He licked his paws and his whiskers. Buck-Buck was flicking some sandwiches off the table into the willing jaws of his friend Buttercup. It was a wonderful tea party. Not one plate was broken. When it was over, the dog licked the floor clean. Boris lost no time in telling Granny about his plan to buy the garden house in the suburbs of Moscow. He explained about the sale of the diamond and his need to transfer the money to a bank in Russia. He explained about going into the street to sing for their supper, making it seem like one big adventure. He was careful not to mention the robber gang or the police. After all, there was no reason to worry her. Granny Anna listened attentively and finally agreed to put the money through her account. At the end, Boris reached into the pillowcase, counted out 1,000 euros, and solemnly handed it to her with both of his wings. "You, my dear lady, have my everlasting gratitude." "But, Boris, I couldn't possibly take this," Granny exclaimed, and blushed as red as a beet. He bowed to her once again and replied with great dignity, "You would insult the honor of a gentleman by refusing this small gift." Then, reaching under his wing, he brought out his little velvet bag. He gave Granny a small crumpled piece of paper with the name of his friend the engineer written on it. "I'm afraid I can't read Russian," said Granny. She was holding the strip of paper upside down. "Well, of course not. How foolish of me," said Boris. He took a deep breath. He had to get this right, and he translated. "Alexander Alexandrovich Kolyakov, engineer, National Bank of Moscow, account number 5499670HB." Granny repeated it back to him. It was absolutely correct. Grandfather let out a sigh of relief. He was suddenly very tired. After tea, everyone politely offered their wing or paw to shake hands with Granny, and they left the house without breaking anything. Jimmy and Granny stood at the open window waving to Buck, Buck and Buttercup. "I'll see you tomorrow, kid. That is if Granny ever lets you out again," teased Buck, Buck. Boris and his grandsons were already on their way back to the hideout under the bridge. They had to get their rest for the long flight back to Moscow. Early next morning, Granny went to the bank and transferred the money to Boris's old friend in Moscow. Then she went home to tidy up her house as usual. Just as she was beginning to sweep, she heard a sharp tapping on the window. Jimmy jumped off of the sofa, delighted to see his friends again. Granny let them in and asked, "Would you like a little something to eat before you go? I wouldn't want you to fly on an empty stomach." "Duh!" shouted Genya. "Eating, always good idea." "We can't really stay," said Boris. "The wind is very good for flying this morning, but we did want to say goodbye, and of course to thank you for everything." Everyone felt a bit sad. Even Granny had tears in her eyes. Genya and Anton promised that they would come back next summer. Granny gave them a small bag of food for the long trip home. They all hugged each other one last time. Granny and Jimmy gazed up into the sky to see their new friends climb higher and higher in the air. The ravens flew off, tilting their wings in a final salute. As they turned east over the flat, green and golden patchwork of Holland's farmland, they came to a great body of water near Amsterdam, above the wide grey waters of the IJsselmeer. Anton looked at his grandfather. "What did you study at the University of Moscow, grandfather? You never told us what you studied there." "Why, the English language, of course, and story writing too." "Can you write on paper, grandfather? With a pen? With real letters and everything?" asked Anton. "Can you read too?" "If you really want to learn to read and write, I'd love to teach you when we get back to Moscow. We don't need a pen. We always use our claws to hold the ink." Boris grinned naughtily at his grandson, gave him a wink, then turned his wise old face towards the east again. They were flying home at last.
Благодарю тебя за то, что со мной была, еще за то, что не забудешься, за шепоты, за крик, за вечность и за миг, за горячую звезду, за смех и за печаль, за тихое прощай, за все тебя благодарю. За смех и за печаль, за тихое тебя благодарю за все, за все.